Hello, my name is Janet Gordon. On behalf of the North York University Women's Club, I want to welcome you to a discussion with Susan Blacklin about her book, Water Confidential, Witnessing Justice Denied, which was published in 2024. This talk is being recorded on April 22nd, 2025, so that those who were unable to attend may view the proceedings at a later date. And now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our special guest tonight. Susan Blacklin is a retired sheepdog breeder, a mother of 4, and she likes painting and gardening. But as well, she's a new author and activist who started the Safe Drinking Foundation and the Water Research Corporation, supporting her husband, Hans Peterson, a scientist who brought safe drinking water to several Saskatchewan Indigenous communities in the early 2000s. Sue has written a memoir which explains the shocking truth of the long-standing injustices in First Nations and farm communities in Canada with regard to the availability of clean water. The established guidelines for water treatment in Canada do not need to be followed and are woefully inadequate. Sue's book leaves us with many questions. Why are there no regulations for water treatment facilities in Canada? Why have our governments thrown away a fortune in construction of inadequate treatment facilities? How come most Canadians know nothing about these terrible situations? Why is contamination of water supplies caused by the oil business not known across the country? We first learned of this problem through Sue's excellent book, and it should be read by every Canadian. And we thank the Georgetown CFUW Club for bringing it to our attention. We're so glad you could join us, Sue. Thank you. So I'll pass it over to Marion and then Sue.
Good evening. I'm Marion Archbold with Janet, the co-advocacy coordinator for UWC-NY, and welcome to everybody, especially Sue Blacklin, our guest tonight. And I just want to let you know that after Susan speaks, we'll be addressing some questions to her, and then it will be open to you to ask her questions. So please put questions in the chat, and I will relay those questions to Sue. And also, we will throw it open to questions from the floor. So after we do questions from the chat, I will look around. But because we have 2 screens on Zoom, it's not as easy to see everybody. So please also make good use of the chat. I'd like to introduce to you Susan Blacklin, who Janet introduced so well. And she is the author of the book, Water Confidential, Witnessing Justice Denied, the Fight for Safe Drinking Water in Indigenous and Rural Communities in Canada. Susan.
Thank you very much to Janet, Marion, and to Jolie for your very nice introductions. And thank you, everybody, for arranging to have me talk with you today. I'd like to start by reading a few words about the land acknowledgement that we often say at all of our meetings, just to start us off here. I wrote, it is not enough for me to acknowledge that I am here on unceded Indigenous territory. I feel I am saying, I know we stole this from you, but so be it. I am searching for what I can add to this statement in solidarity with First Nations. So far, my way of acknowledging it is to state, I give thanks to First Nations for both allowing and enabling me to live a life of privilege on their lands. I try to acknowledge my appreciation of this gift by standing in solidarity on the myriad of issues where they have been wrong. In part, writing this book is my declaration that I stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in Canada. I do not profess to have all the answers. I hope that by sharing what I know with others, many will open their eyes and minds to new ways of thinking, processing what they learn or need to unlearn, and pressure those in positions of power to step up and take appropriate action. So with that, I hope it's not the standard land acknowledgement, but I hope it gives you a little bit of an idea of my perspective on where we are on that issue. I do a lot of these presentations, if you want to call them that. It's more open discussions because I meet with book clubs, sometimes women's group, once or twice a week and give the Zooms and talk about anything that pops up. And one of the things I'd like to just start off by mentioning is that I am working on my second book. And the reason for that is in the beginning, people said, oh, what you wrote about was 15 or 20 years ago, and it's much better now. And sometimes people like to put their head in the sand and pretend it is a lot better. And from what I'm uncovering, it's a lot worse. And one of the ladies here, when we were first talking, was mentioning about fundraising and sending money to First Nations to help them with a water truck. And that's beautiful and wonderful and very caring. The only problem I see is that there is no shortage of money for First Nations anywhere. And so that might come a little bit shocking to you, but it's rather like a statement that was made in 2004 conference. It was called The Future of Drinking Water in Canada. And the leading world expert on at that time was Colin Fricker. And he asked people if they thought testing their drinking water was a way of ensuring that they had safe drinking water. And he assured them it was not. It was not. Testing for water will do nothing to ensure that you have safe drinking water. And in the same way, it might be shocking to you, but there is no shortage of money. In fact, there is a surplus of money that's being thrown around in the name of solving drinking water issues, but it is not reaching the source of the problem. It is going off to numerous groups, organizations, NGOs, individuals, engineers, consultants, you name it, are trying to jump on the bandwagon because the money is there for the taking, but it is not being used to correct the problem. So when I do these talks, generally speaking, everybody has read my book. So I wonder if I could ask, is there a possibility to take a show of hands? I'd like to know if I'm talking to people who have read my book or who haven't, because that might change what I say. Is there a possibility to tell from all those in attendance? Do we have half the people have read it or all the people? Who am I talking
Okay,
to?
so can everyone either put their hand up like I'm doing, trying to show, or put the little hand, the little icon up from your if you the what are they the tools? Use one of the pictures to put your hand up. So I think a fair number have read the book. I'm seeing quite a few hands raised.
Okay, thank you. It just gives me an idea of what people might know or might not know, okay? So one of the things that really impressed me and really humbled me following the launch of my book was that the Congress of Humanities selected my book, and it was then became part of curriculum in universities across the country as part of Indigenous studies. That was just like blew me away because I finished school at 15 and I haven't had any further education. So for me, that was a really humbling experience. The BC Department of Education also selected my book and put it into high schools for social studies and science, which is fabulous, except that I've yet to be able to find a high school that's carried through and done that. And so I sometimes wonder where the bureaucracy wants to control what people know. And maybe it's just that people don't have time and so forth. But one of the things I'm doing for my new book is seeking out freedom of information requests. I've made over 40 requests, and I'd like to give you a little indication of what's at stake here, because out of the 40, I've received responses for maybe 6. And I've received probably 15 responses saying no records available. Now, when I tell you that Neskantaga has had a drinking water advisory, the longest standing drinking water advisory in Canada of over 30 years now, and they were just in the Globe and Mail over Easter weekend, and they stated here that Indigenous Services Canada funded a water treatment plant upgrade in 2017. The department says it has already invested $31.5 million into this one community. Now, I think I'm on number 7 now, Freedom of Information requests for Neskantaga First Nation, asking them for copies of contracts that have been awarded with any money that's gone to anybody, be it another government department, an engineering company, a consultant, individuals, anybody that's received money to improve or rebuild in any way the Neskantaga First Nations water treatment plant. And they have come back 6 times now and said no records available. Now, I don't know how the government can spend $31.5 million and have no records available. So either they are extremely incompetent or they have a huge cover-up job at heart. I don't know which it is. But I'm keeping going with them, trying to find out. Now, the same thing has happened for Grassy Narrows. I think I've put in 4 or 5 requests there and no records available. Grassy Narrows has spent millions and is now having a wellness treatment center built. And I'm thinking it's in the $50 million range because of the extensive mercury poisoning that's affected everybody in that community. How they can have all that money spent and have no records available, I don't know. On the 2 or 3 communities that I have received the numbers for them, it is such a mishmash of copies of one-pagers and a few emails thrown in, and nothing is in any kind of formal audited statement. And yet each First Nation has to pay a bill for official audited statements every year. But there is nothing available for each individual community. And when I see things like an entire treaty area for 1 year, nobody has any numbers for any community in that treaty, I find that really alarming. And then when I see the exact same numbers to a penny for every single expense for 3 years in a row, for every community in that treaty, I find that equally alarming. So all I'm telling you is that I think there is extreme inefficiency, perhaps corruption, negligence, lack of due diligence. All those things are alive and well with very big money, which is your money, which is your taxpayer money, going out to try and in the name of fixing First Nations water. But at the same time as we talk about First Nations water, we have over 1,400 boil water advisories in effect right now across Canada. BC is the leader with over 400. And there's 30 in First Nations. Now, the average First Nation is probably going to be 300 people, thereabouts, maybe 5. But the average rural community is probably going to be 5 to 10,000 people with a boil water advisory. We have an extreme acute problem for white society, just as bad as Indigenous, but the white society isn't in the news the way Indigenous issues are. So this is a problem across the country for everybody, because when you drive through little ABC town in Northern Ontario, or when you're going to the cottage, you stop to pick up a coffee or a tea or whatever, do you really pay attention where the boiled water advisories are? And if there are boiled water advisories, are they keeping to them? Are they notifying everybody who drives through? This is a huge, huge problem. There are many waterborne illnesses that take 15 to 30 years to materialize and show themselves in your body. And when they do, can be very ugly. So this is a really big problem across the country. This is not an Indigenous issue. So what I'd like to do is see if anybody has any questions. Maybe there's a path or somewhere that I can go down to talk about what sort of things did people feel when they read the book? Were they left with questions? What if, why didn't you? It must be better now, or what was the concerns? What didn't you understand? Because science is not easy to understand. I was fortunate in that my husband at that time, Hans, wrote a lot of peer-reviewed papers. And when he wrote the peer-reviewed papers, I didn't have a clue what he was saying. But anything that he wrote that was going out into the public domain, we had an agreement that if I couldn't understand it, he couldn't send it out, or he couldn't publish it. It had something that if I could understand it, then it could go. Because the average person, I like to think of myself as the average person. Most science goes so high above my head, I just don't get it. And I was the kid who knocked the Bunsen burners over in science in high school. I was never serious about science. So it's not an easy thing for people to take in.
Susan, we have one question already. Can mercury be removed from water?
I think it can be removed on a small scale if you have and I'm talking about a small amount of water. I think there are ways of removing it, but I don't think you can remove it from large-scale source waters, which is the problem. And so one of the things that comes to mind is the mercury in Grassy Narrows and their need for the wellness center. And I question why taxpayers are now paying this $50 million for the wellness center. Why isn't the pulp and paper mill paying for this, who have put out the toxic waste, not just when they didn't know what it did, but have continually put it out after they knew that it was toxic and what it was doing to the community? And why did the government allow them to do that?
Perhaps for the benefit of those that didn't read your book, can you tell us how you, who left school, as you said, at age 15, and later emigrated to Canada, where you met Hans, and together founded the Safe Drinking Water Foundation and achieved so much. Can you tell us a little bit about how this developed?
Yeah, absolutely. Hans was actually working with China at the time, the country of China, because they had acute arsenic poisoning in a lot of their wells in China, and he was trying to work with them on developing a system that would remove the arsenic. He gave a presentation in a health inspectors conference that happened to be held in Regina, Saskatchewan. One of the health inspectors there was filling in on a temporary basis for the permanent health inspector. And she called, and she was relentless in calling. It started off once a week, and then it became once a day, and she did not give up until she got Hans to go out there. When he went out there, he was almost in tears when he returned home. He could not believe it, because this community was the Yellow Quill First Nation. They only had a source water to draw on in the spring when it was the spring runoff, and they all got terribly, terribly ill. And it's because the white community that was very close, their sewage lagoon overflowed with the runoff, and that became their source water. So it was so disgusting and so awful. He vowed to help them and became their spokesperson. And we were very, very fortunate in that there was a really, really genuine good egg at Indigenous, it was then called INAC, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. It's now called Indigenous Services Canada. But at the time, there was a Finn there who was looking after the distribution of funds in Saskatchewan. His name was Yoko Kokomini, and he was a wonderful man who did not care two hoots about the status quo or what he was supposed to do. He did what he felt was right, and he funded Hans to stay on reserve for 2 years and develop the first biological water treatment system. As far as I know, and at that time, as far as we knew then, it was the first biological system in the world that did not require any chemicals. It removes things because Hans would describe it as being a biological smorgasbord. Many of the things that you want to remove from the water are so minuscule you cannot catch them with a filter. But if you introduce a bug up the food chain that's going to eat the little smallest guy, then you can catch the bigger bugs much easier in the filter. And so it went on with 6 different membranes, different sizes of the food chain, feeding them through. And I'm sorry, I can't answer you what the different things were, whether they were protozoa or whatever they were, but one ate the other until you had big enough to filter them out of that membrane and put the water onto the next one. And it worked extremely well. And it was in keeping with Indigenous culture and beliefs because they do not want chlorine in their water. Very often, Health Canada did insist on chlorine being added as a final treatment process. It was more to keep Health Canada happy so that they could have the last say than the fact that it was necessary, because it's quite typical and often a common in rural white communities that the water treatment operator is often maybe he's the mayor or a councillor, or he owns the drugstore in town or something like that, but he's not somebody who's very well informed about all the issues with water. And the thinking then is often, okay, well, if we're supposed to add 1 jug of chlorine, let's add 2, because 2 must be better than 1. And that's not the case, because if you add too much chlorine, if you ever go anywhere and you smell chlorine in the water, do not drink it, but do not shower in it. Because as soon as you can smell chlorine in the water, it is almost guaranteed that you're going to have very high trihalomethones, which are something that you ingest into your lungs and become critically ill down the road. So too much chlorine is also a serious problem. It's not the answer.
Can you tell us a bit more about the Safe Drinking Water Foundation, please?
Yeah. Once he realized what was happening in Yellow Quill, we were so naive. First of all, we thought all the politicians just didn't know what the reality was. I mean, surely they wouldn't let this go on if they knew. And so we started a big campaign to provincial and then to federal MLAs and to MPs and to MLAs in all provinces across the country. He wrote in numerous publications that reached out to those same people. And it became apparent to us that this was not a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge about it. It was a lack of will to do something. And so then we figured, okay, if the powers that be don't want to be educated, we should at least start with educating the next generations. So I think it was 98 or 99 that we started with our first program for schools. It was called Operation Water Drop. And it only had 6 things that we tested for that first year, only available in English. And gradually we received recognition. The McDonald Foundation funded a program called Green Street, which certified environmental programs. And they started off giving us funding for 3 years. They carried it through for 5 years. So our school programs expanded from Operation Water Drop. I think it now has something like 15 parameters that it tests for in their water. We brought in Operation Water Spirit, which was an indigenous perspective of the water issues. We had our lessons translated into Cree before we had them translated into French, because Cree is the most common of indigenous languages. We brought up, we created programs in math, because it's not just a case of looking at the science of water, but the math, we encourage them to look at the quantity of water, how much was being used, how much was being wasted. At the time that we did that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but if anywhere in Canada, in any white community, was planning how much water a community needed, they had something like 280 liters per day per person. If the federal government was planning any kind of treatment for any kind of indigenous community, they were allocated 153 liters per day per person. I don't know if they were not supposed to wash or not supposed to drink or not supposed to wash their food. I don't know what they were supposed to do less than what the white people did. But it was that sort of thing that I found so terribly discriminating. One of the things we did to develop those programs, which I really, really thoroughly enjoyed, was that we took advantage of the HRDC summer student program for university students. And we'd put in, and each year we'd get 2 or 3 students. And I would give them the task of creating something that's going to inspire the students, be something that is applicable for them to learn, rather than to regurgitating the different scientific symbols and so forth, something that they can apply. We involved it with language arts on how to write to your town mayor or council or your premier, how to write a letter to the newspaper, how to look into the different boiled water advisories that were close by and what you might want to do about it. It was very much an action-packed program for various subjects in various grades. It went anywhere from grade 4 to grade 12. That time, I think actually Ontario had a grade 13 for a couple of years before that ended, but basically from grade 4 to grade 12.
Susan, once Hans invented the system in Yellow Quill, could he then adapt it for other communities, or does the scientist have to start over each time?
No, it was fairly simple for a scientist, that is. It wouldn't be for me, it wouldn't be simple, but for somebody who's already a scientist or a biologist, it would be fairly simple to duplicate. So after the 2 years of living at Yellow Quill, he then spent 2 years living at the Saddle Lake First Nation in Alberta. Yellow Quill was a groundwater system. That means the water came from a well, albeit spring runoff, but by going deeper with the well, they then treated that water. Saddle Lake was a surface water community. Saddle Lake itself was quite a vast lake, but it was absolutely overloaded with blue-green algae, which is highly toxic and very problematic. After the 2.5 years at Saddle Lake, he went to Stanley Mission in northern Saskatchewan, and he then applied the same program, or the same process, I should say, to treating sewage treatment at Stanley Mission. And if you ever go by a sewage treatment plant and it stinks, the plant is not working effectively. We have one just down the road here. It makes me ill because it has stunk so bad for 10 years, and just now it's getting an upgrade. No sewage treatment plant should ever smell. You should be able to live next door to it with no problem. And the same biological principle was used in all of those systems. It then went on, and we have over 40 that have that system in place now. It could easily have been put into every single First Nation across the country. It would have just been a matter of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, not millions of dollars, that is. the system we were proposing would have gone in and provided a base in each community where every community member could have gone with a jug of water and filled it up as often as they liked all day long. The problems in First Nations usually stems because their homes are a long distance apart. They're geographically spread out, very often on a very rocky terrain. To build a distribution system is challenging and costly. But then when you combine that with the fact that few First Nations remain in their homes for 12 months of the year, most of them go out and work their trap lines, or in the summer months go out for months on end, live in the wilderness, which is where they like to be. And so then you've got this distribution line sitting inactive with very little water being drawn out. As soon as that happens, as soon as you're not drawing on that water, bacteria are going to collect and grow. The problems always come in the distribution line. And although Indian and Northern Affairs will fund putting in an update or a new water treatment plant, they repeatedly will not fund maintenance of their distribution lines. So the three communities that were the three first to be put in Saskatchewan, Yellow Quill, Pasqua, and George Gordon, ran for over 20 years without a single hiccup until just last year, at the same time as my book launched. All three were put on a boiled water advisory, and it was purely because for 20 years, Indigenous Services Canada had refused to fund maintenance of their distribution line.
And does this mean that then they have to have new systems installed?
No, but it means it all has to be flushed out. Just imagine your pipes with gross things in them, you know? You've got to really flush it out. I don't know that they call it pigging it. I don't know what pigging it means, but it's putting through a large amount of water at a very strong force, almost like you might pressure wash your driveway or something like that. And that blows it out of the lines. And then you have to wait a period of time, and there's certain amounts of chlorine used, but then you have to flush them all through, and then you have to backwash to make sure any of the valves are not collecting anything. It's not an easy process.
And is there a will to do something about it or not? From what you said, it sounds like not.
If there is, I haven't found one.
Yeah.
I can't say there isn't one, but I'm not aware of it. There's also sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's also an extreme pushback because on the average First Nation community, any system that's in effect right now will require inordinate amounts of chemicals, generally over $100,000 a year spent in chemicals if a population of 300 people. That same thing applies to all of the rural white communities as well. So the pushback is A, from the chemical companies because they're losing business. B, it's from the engineering companies because it's much easier for them to put in the same old system that they've put in 100 times already, and they just change their name on the top of the template of what they're putting in. That's how they make the most money. It always comes down to money. There's so many people along the way that don't want to give up what they're making. It doesn't matter if it's ineffective, so long as they make their dollars.
I have another question from the floor. I really enjoyed your book. Why do you think Canada isn't doing more about safe drinking water?
There's two things, and I'm hopeful for one of them. One is that we have this constitution where there's so much power given to the provinces, and each province is like a mother hen trying to protect her own area of chicken scratch, and they won't work together. And so I'm really hopeful that all this that's gone on with this orange guy down south, you know,
Yes.
I'm hopeful that that's going to make people get their act together and work together, because it's not just in water. I mean, I see it in education. They might get taught about water in grade 4. They might not get it to grade 7. If a kid moves towns or provinces, they might not get it at all. And there's that sort of thing happening everywhere. I mean, I'm sure you see it with healthcare, with drug coverage and so forth, with our judicial system. It's all loosey-goosey because every province is different, but it really hits home when it's water, because everybody has a right to safe drinking water. So that's a big part of the reason. Another big part is that in the prairies, it's probably the most challenging water to treat. I think I can say of any waters that Hans advised on around the world, and that was India, China, Thailand. The water on the prairies is extremely challenging because of the high incidence of naturally occurring problems. Now, if you look at that too, you can say that BC is the one that's the best off province, because most systems that are put in, even today in BC, they don't even test or analyze the water, because here most Indigenous people never signed any treaties, and they like to think that the source waters are very pristine. They are compared to the prairies. They usually fall down the mountains instead of coming out of the ground. But keep in mind, right now, out of 1,400 boil water advisories across the country, BC has 450. So that's telling me that it's not as pristine as they'd like to make it out to be.
Interesting.
If I just look at the numbers, there's no logic to that.
One thing that intrigues me is the what makes water safe. No, sorry. I've lost my questions. Where are they? Can you explain what actually makes the rural and First Nations drinking water so bad? I think this is a good thing to follow up the last discussion.
Okay, primarily across the country, it's not just big oil, it's pulp and paper, it's the diamond mines, it's industry of all shapes, sizes, and different areas that are all allowed to release their toxic effluent into the waterways. If there is one thing that would change everybody's drinking water without even doing anything to any of the water treatment systems, if we could just ban industry from releasing their effluent into our waterways, we would be light years ahead. Because if you can have a higher quality of source water, you're going to require far less processes and dollars to make that water safe. Plus, it needs to be safe according to the World Health Organization, not according to the federal standards for Indigenous peoples are way down here. They've just selected these numbers, and that's totally okay for them. Now, if you go to Ontario, yours are up here, but that's only thanks to the Walkerton crisis, the Walkerton inquiry. They made all kinds of changes. So now Walkerton has a very high level. Every other province is in between, except that all the people in Ontario have this high level of standards for their drinking water, except First Nations, because they're under the federal law. They're still down here in Ontario. The Walkerton inquiry only improved drinking water for white people.
Is there anything else? Are there minerals in the ground and things in the ground that affect drinking water?
Oh yes, totally. All over the country, and I can't begin to go there on the science of that. But no matter where you test, you will find there's something that's a challenge, and it's not necessarily going to be the same, even in two communities that are quite close together. It might be, but it might not.
I have a couple of questions here. One is, should we mail a copy of your book to every elected politician? That would be nice.
I would. The thing is, I sent copies to Patty Haydew, to Simon Fraser, to Trudeau himself. to Chrystia Friedland. I'm trying to remember who else I've sent them to, with personal notes. I can send all the books I like, but you can't make them read it.
Yeah, it's the problem.
So,
And carry on.
so yeah, I think it's a lovely idea, and I wish they would. But I think if nothing else, we're going to be launching a very different plan of attack in the fall following this election, because we now feel, and I might be jumping the gun here, and I hope I'm not out of place with all your people there, but I'm really hoping that Carney is our next Prime Minister. If he is, he's a numbers man. And his book, Values, really speaks to that. You've got to have a return on the dollar. And there's a huge return on the dollar if you have safe drinking water. I don't know where it begins and ends because the ramifications are so great. And there's no need for this waste of government departments. So I'm really hopeful that we can look forward to some good things happening. We are planning to refocus this petition based on the economics of water, because he is the economics background. But of course, we have to wait for the election to happen. Then we have to wait for all the ministers to be appointed and so forth. We give them a couple of months. And during the summer, we feel that most people don't have the time to get involved in things like this. So we're looking at getting it launched late August, ready for September, when people will be coming back to their desks. And then what we'd like to encourage at that time is that everybody phone every MP and every MLA, not just once, maybe once a week, maybe once a month, just keep phoning them. So what are you doing about it? You know, trying to put the pressure on that way with the individuals. And we will be sending a package to every newly elected MP.
Great. So the next question is, have any corporations, mining or other, made payments towards cleaning up the polluted water systems?
Absolutely zero. And one of the things that I talked about in the book, I'm not sure if I had I think I had a chapter to it, Swan Hill's toxic waste dump. I think it was in there. The Lives at Risk Downstream. It was chapter 15. And I talked in there about the number of people around northern Alberta, north of Edmonton, the Driftpile First Nation, a number of other First Nations, which had terrible high numbers of very rare cancers. The doctor, the physician for that community, Dr. John O'Connor, rang the alarm bells with Health Canada that these cancers should not be showing up in these people in such significant numbers. And Health Canada's response was to throw 12 lawyers at him and accuse him of being fear-mongering and an alarmist. He basically almost lost everything he owned. And luckily, the Canadian physicians and surgeons came out in support of him, and they passed a whistleblower, what should I say, strategy or something, or endorsement, that if any doctor ever does a whistleblowing, that the organization will stand behind them. And after that, Health Canada did back down. But this was because the Swan Hills toxic waste dump, which is, I can't remember the actual elevation, but it is way up there. It's not a high mountain like Everest or the high mountains in the Rockies, but nevertheless, it's a high elevation. And they placed this toxic waste dump on the top of a mountain. Now, I don't know how stupid you have to be to realize that whatever you put up there is going to run down. I mean, it's it's a no-brainer, right? And they actually got slammed with Canada's largest environmental fine of $650,000 against the Alberta government. And that, I want to say, is around 2003 or something, like 2005 maybe. And they were going to change their ways, etc., etc. Well, the keepers of the water have just gone to mediation sessions now, 3 decades later, where the Alberta government thinks it's absolutely fine to continue that plant operational. And none of the responsibility should lie on government or on the oil industry for basically the genocide that's happening on the First Nations down below after 3 decades.
Okay. I have one question here. What do you think would be the best way to ensure that legislation creating Canadian regulations setting science-based standards for water treatment rather than the inadequate guidelines we now have becomes Canadian law?
Well, do you remember that story? I'm going to say it was 20 or 30 years ago. We used to see it. It was a bit like a cartoon. There was a kid throwing starfish back into the beach, and the old man comes up and says, "What are you doing that for? There's hundreds, thousands of them. You'll never be able to throw them all back into the water." And the little kid says, "Well, I made a difference for this one, okay?" So we made a difference for about 40 communities. But the ending of that story is that the old man pitches in and starts throwing the starfish back in the water too. So unless an awful lot of Canadians start pressuring their MPs, that's the only way we're going to affect change. I can't do it. No one person can do it. And it's got to happen from a large number of Canadians who say enough is enough. This has to change now.
And compared to the rest of the G8, do they all have regulations, or are we the only one that doesn't, or do most of them have or have not regulations?
Australia is the only one who does not have regulations. And I forget the phrase that the World Health Organization used about them, but it was quite despicable criticism of Australia. And their problem very much replicates ours in that their Indigenous people have suffered a big brunt of the problem. Every other developed country in the world has regulations. Even the US had, I'll say had regulations. I don't know if they're still there.
That's something we really have to work for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask Susan Goldenberg to unmute and ask her question because I don't quite understand it, Susan. So if you could unmute and ask Susan Blacklin your question.
Hi,
Please.
Susan. Nice name. My question was, is there any solid evidence that the money that has been misspent on extravagances, sort of on wine, woman, and song, instead of the needed purpose? And secondly, why do you think the federal government hasn't cracked down?
The federal government is the easiest one to answer. They haven't cracked down because they're really not in control. The corporations are in control. That's what capitalism has done for our democracy.
And if you could answer the first question.
And what was the first one again? Sorry.
Has the money, is there any evidence that the money has been spent on extravagances, luxury?
That's what's going in my second book. I think there's a lot of evidence. And I also predict that there are a number of First Nations organizations who want to take responsibility, and I get that they want to have their responsibility. However, I see a likeness to what's happened in South Africa following the apartheid, when the Black community have stepped up to take over businesses and so forth, but without the education and without the knowledge. As much as I greatly respect their cultural traditions, their beliefs, but we can't wish our way and we can't pray our way to safe water. We can only get safe water when Indigenous knowledge embraces Western science and puts it to the benefit, the good use of the Indigenous people. But this is also applicable to the white communities. It's not just Indigenous. And right now, there's no political will to do it. And the pushback from those who don't want change is huge.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to ask anybody who would like to ask a question in person to put the sign up, the raise your hand sign up so you come to the top of the screen. Otherwise, I won't see you if you just raise your hand like this. So use the signal. And while Susan answers this question, are there any other scientists working on this cause at the moment?
Well, that's one of the things I tried to find out, and one of my freedom of requests was for charities who might be working on this issue. I believe the data I got has in the year 2000 there were about 80,000 charities registered in Canada. Now there's about 86,000. The percentage of charities with water in their name was how I tried to look at a comparison, and that's remained at about 4 to 5%. It really hasn't changed. But what has changed is the number of churches, the number of religious groups with water in their name. That has gone up by about 12%, and the number of charities who are not religious based has actually dropped to about 2 or 3%. I've not been able to find another charity that works on drinking water quality. There's many that work on source water protection and quantity, but not on quality. And there's many who work for the benefit of developing countries, but very few for Canada.
Thank you. Maureen Daly has a question.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Susan. This has been excellent learning for me. I have a question. I'm sorry, I haven't read the book, and I've learned a lot from this discussion and your presentation. My question is, how is it that with the discrepancies or misappropriation of fund, when you hear, the Auditor General's report, it comes out, is that provincial, like, I watch the news, why am others like me not more aware? I'm certainly aware of specific Indigenous communities, but in the whole national, I'm not hearing anything. Well, how is it missed in the media?
Well, I'll give you an example. About 2 weeks ago, we watched CBC, and I don't want to be misunderstood here because I love CBC. I want to keep CBC. But about 2 weeks ago, when all the protests started happening in the US, CBC didn't cover it. CBC aired a little thing about some actors in Ontario who used to reenact a war of 1612 with the USA, and they were reenacting it again that year. There was nothing about all the protests in the US. And if they've covered them since then, it's been minimal. And the media has a huge responsibility here. Sometimes they have their own agenda, and Indigenous issues has never reached the top of their agenda while I've been watching them. But they also don't go out of their way to seek things. And coupled with the government, where I believe it's actual corruption. And it's criminal what's happened to a lot of these dollars. And I mean, Neskantaga alone, $30 million, and they can't even account for it. They say there's no records available. Something's wrong.
That's where I'm confused, because when we hear of the Auditor General, or who's the overseer of the books at the federal level, how is that not being seen? So, like, I'm dumbstruck.
Well, my grandpa used to have a saying, nobody's as blind as he who doesn't want to see.
Okay.
I don't know. If I had an answer for it, I wouldn't need to write this book.
Thank you.
I cannot understand it. I can't see any logic. One of the things I did when I made one of the first requests for freedom of information I did it for Neskantaga and Grassy Narrows. I got a no records available back. I did it again. I got a no records available back. And I'm shaking my head thinking, what am I missing here? What am I not putting in the wording? Why am I not getting this? And then my cell phone rang, and it was a really weird number. It was like 444-333-2221. I thought, well, that's weird. I'm not picking that up, And 5 minutes later, the same number, 44433, across the screen. Thought, well, I better pick it up. This is a bit weird. Picked it up, and there's an Indigenous person from Northern Ontario on a satellite phone from a very remote community. And he says to me, I just want to reach out to you because he said, I've seen your request for information with Indigenous Services Canada, and I've seen the reply they've sent to you. And I just want you to know that there are plenty of records available. He said, but instead of asking for grants for contracts and agreements, he said, I think if you change the wording and ask for contribution agreements and grants, he said, I think then you'll be able to get your information. So, oh, great. Send that in, do another one. Back it comes, no records available. So, am I labeled? Do they not want to give them to me? All sorts of thoughts cross my mind. It's impossible for no records to be available. Because if there are no records, then they're doubly irresponsible because they haven't kept track of the money they've spent. Where does it begin and end? I don't know. But there was another interesting thing too. Just a couple of weeks ago, I participated in a Zoom call. I'm trying to think of, it's some kind of think tank in Canada that advises charities on how to proceed politically to get their issues addressed. And so it was a special Zoom on how to deal with the upcoming change of government and so forth. So he went through all the different possibilities and what they expect to happen and how long it's going to take and so forth. And at the very end of the meeting, before everybody signed off, he said, I just want you all to know, I want to remind you all that while all the MPs change and the PMO office staff changes and the Prime Minister changes, he said, we can change all of those, but all the civil servants will remain. And those of you that read my book, I had a statement in there, and I'm trying to remember who said it to me at the time. I think it was Warren Golding, who wrote another book, Just Another Indian. But anyways, the statement was that for most civil servants, if they don't like the agenda of the incoming government, their practice is to just sit it out and wait, because in 4 years it will change. So I'm really not sure. Maybe it's the civil servants running the country and not the corporations. I don't know. But it's not being run ethically. It's not being run fairly, in no due diligence. But don't lose sight of the fact it's not just an Indigenous issue.
Interesting. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to put? Any other comments?
Everyone should feel welcome to just unmute themselves and ask a question if they don't want to put it in the chat.
Marion, we should only have a couple more at the most because it's 8 o'clock.
Oh dear. So I also want to say that I hope I haven't been too depressing to everybody, but unless we all become aware of this, we can't make change unless we all do it together, and knowledge is the basis for change.
I have a question, Susan.
Please.
I really enjoyed this very much. There isn't enough information out there that we're aware of, that we have people sick and dying because our water is such bad shape. What I'm wondering about, we have an organization that at the very least within hours, they can collect their equipment and send it over to countries where people have had a disaster, and they can set up their equipment and provide clean water for the victims or the people in those countries. Who funds that? Where do they get their funding for that?
Boy, I can't tell you, but it's probably charities. It's probably from donations.
Because if, yeah, if we can do that, why not can we pay attention to what's going on here? It just, it makes you feel so angry that there are things you can do and nobody wants to step up and do it.
One of the things, though, is that while they might do this for developing countries and they might drastically improve the water in that developing country, I highly doubt it measures up to Canadian guidelines, let alone WHO standards.
Okay.
Okay, they can remove a lot and they can clean it a lot and they'll probably get by. So I'm going to say it was around 1970 that the World Health Organization funded a huge number of wells to be dug in Bangladesh to give all the people water. It wasn't until around 1990, it was 25 years later that they had huge health problems in all those communities. And then they realized this is the World Health Organization. They hadn't tested the treated water. And although they dug it wasn't treated water, they hadn't tested the well water. Once they did, it was so high in arsenic. So all these people in all these communities had arsenic poisoning, which was just devastating. I mean, they were losing their fingers, their toes, their limbs, never mind their skin problems all over their bodies. It was brutal. And so you can go in and do these things and you can be seen as, oh, that's wonderful, that's great. I wouldn't want the liability behind any of them doing it.
Yep. So, Susan, thank you. I do have one final question from our group. What can we do to help? And Janet put one suggestion in, so I thought I'd pass that on to you and then let you tell us what else we can do. She suggests that we should push for your book to be on CBC Reads. So I don't know whether you've been able to do that or how. I think many of you probably all tune into CBC Reads. So write in and suggest that they put this book on their list. And Susan, over to you.
That would be wonderful. That would be great. And it's not that I'm saying this with sort of a conceited heart, but it's just that I want more people to read and be aware. I want them to learn about it. And that alone would be fabulous. If you could ask your national office to get behind it and maybe do things like this for all the chapters across the country or all the book clubs in CFUW or whatever we can do. But if we could tie it in at the time when we do the petition in the fall, when we have another big push, because we got 2,000 signatures on that petition. Now, the largest number of signatures on any petition ever was 40,000. And that was following Trudeau's election after he reneged on promising proportional representation. People went out and got 40,000 signatures, but a petition still isn't any guarantee. It's a guarantee it will get read in the House. They'll have to talk about it. But Trudeau's answer to that petition about proportional representation was it was not put forward by a sufficient number of Canadian citizens. It wasn't a significant number of Canadian citizens. I mean, he'd made his mind up he wasn't do that. He never intended to do that. And so we can push for this petition, but that still won't mean anything will happen. It's just another way of getting more people aware and putting more pressure on. It's only going to happen when enough people continuously put pressure on. Look up where your boil water advisories are in Ontario. I imagine you've got some close by. In fact, I went to Goderich last year on my book tour, and the Lake Huron, you go down to the beach at Lake Huron, and there's a massive poster, and it says, all swimmers must avoid getting any water in their eyes, nose, or mouth. There's kids in the water. How are you going to go in the water and not get water in your eyes, nose, and mouth? So it doesn't just end at the kitchen tap, you know. But you've got boil water advisories all around you. See where your First Nations are that have them. Put a call into them. How are they coping with it? What can you do to help them? Tell them about my book. Tell them, you know, about the systems that do work and so forth. Because there's no need for anybody to be living like this.
Thank you, Susan. This has been most wonderful and an engaging and informative evening. I think everyone, whether they've read the book or not, and I'm sure those who haven't read it will be rushing out to get it out of the library or buy it, and read it after tonight. You have informed us and enlightened us about these issues, brought it to life. Our club did support the petition in the winter, and
I remember.
I am going to get in touch with Jane from Georgetown, who sent me a lovely letter saying why she couldn't come tonight. And we will be behind it all the way. Our club has a lot of experience contacting MPs, so we will take that under advisement and do that.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad you talked about, one of my big questions was about why are we always hearing about boil water advisories? Why are we hearing about them for 30 years and more, and nothing ever seems to happen? And you answered that question for me. I am so glad, and not glad about why, but I am glad to hear that it's because of inaction and lack of data and just this kind of inertia to move and deal with the issue. And I'm so glad that you are working on it. And I can't thank you enough for coming and speaking to us. And one of the things that we can do individually, and one thing that we as a club are doing, is giving a very small donation to the Safe Water Drinking Foundation that Susan founded. And tomorrow we will send it out in an e-blast, the organization, and how you personally, if you wish, can give an amount of your choosing to the Safe Water Drinking Foundation to help Susan and her group do their work.
Thank you
Thank you,
very, very much.
Susan.
I really appreciate that. And just so that everybody knows, all the royalties for my book go equally between Safe Drinking Water Foundation and Keepers of the Water. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That's
you,
much
everybody,
appreciated.
and good night.